welcome to the inaugural Full Circle podcast on this inauguration day in the United States of America. I'm just one of your hosts. I'm David Roberts, and I'll allow my other co-hosts to introduce themselves. Why don't you start off, Dre?
How you doing? I'm Dre Taylor.
And we have the OG, Dr. Neil Holmes.
And I'm Neil Holmes.
Guys, why don't we talk?
Other gangster, not the old gangster.
I stand corrected. Why don't we talk briefly, since this is our first podcast, first of many, hopefully. Why don't we talk briefly about how this came together? And I guess I should start that off because in 1987, I can't believe how long ago that was, I matriculated into the University of Akron. And I became very active with the Black United Students Organization. And I met this man, the OG, Dr. Neil Holmes, who was the head of African American Studies at the University of Akron at that time. And he was also the staff liaison to Black United students. So Dr. Holmes, did you want to talk a little briefly about that period?
Oh, yeah, that was a very interesting period. When Dave came on campus, we had a whole group of young folks came. I was actually the faculty advisor to what we call BUS, Black United Students. And this was a very activist group. These student organizations, they have leadership that goes up and down and up and down. And Dave, who was then known as Davy D, was part of that leadership group. And they actually reinvigorated the campus. And we did quite a few things, quite a few things. And that was also right around the time that we started looking at things like the South Africa, the movement to disinvest. We did jazz programs on campus, all sorts of little things. And this was a very, a group that was, I really had a group that was very active on the campus and willing to speak openly to the university administration in terms of their issues, their needs, and their interests, and be an advocate for the African community on campus. It was also a community, a student group that was working quite a bit, like with the we had the African American students bus, we had the African students, and I remember one time we had and there had some disagreements between the blacks from the U.S. and folks from Africa, so we had a big party to see who could out-party the. So instead of fighting it out, we had a party out, and that brought folks together, I think, a little bit. They also did a lot of black male, female kind of interactions. So it was a very activist group.
And you
made
one
of those activists.
Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Holmes, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I'm good.
I was going to just make a point that you touched on something that was real important. You were the first one to teach me about the African diaspora, because coming as a high school student, from Cleveland into college, I basically thought of myself as just a Black American. I knew, about the African connection, but I didn't look at it as Africans throughout the world, throughout the globe. And you were the one that taught me, about the African diaspora and a lot of others, so fast forward 10 years, taking the influence that you had given me, and which kind of catapulted me into education because I wanted to work with young people. I went in as a business major, but 10 years later, I'm working in education. So I took a job as a counselor in Philadelphia, and I met this young man, Andre Taylor, who was a 11th grader at the time, I believe, Andre, correct? Yeah. And did you want to talk a little bit about that time and, some of the influences that you had? And
yeah, so I was a part of a program called Legacy at Ben Franklin High School in Philadelphia. And the person before you had left, and we was like, well, I guess that's the end of it. But then you showed up, and we was like, well, who's this guy? And they say he's from Cleveland. I remember a bunch of us like, what's that? Because being from Philly, we right. Philadelphia is Philadelphia. And like right away, we got to see you were a cool person. You were cool but respected. So that's the one thing that I think was good about you. And then at the time, I was heavily involved with football at the time, and um, football was life at the time, and I had one goal to become a journalist in life, and um, I made that happen, but football was all I was. Once I was in the halls of Ben Franklin, all I cared about was football. And then I remember one time we had said, if he's cool here and we don't want the heat from the coaches, why don't we give him to be a coach? And that's why we tried to talk you into being a football coach at Franklin.
But there was no money in the budget, so.
So yeah, that was a good time. It was very formidable years for me, because it was just like, okay, you're thinking about college. Are you going to go to college? Where are you going to go to college? And my situation was different from others, because it was like, all right, you're going to be able to go to college, but somebody's going to pay for it in the form of a football scholarship. So
Right.
I was different, from other people in that aspect. But yeah, it was cool to have the interaction through the legacy program. And not only that, but we got to interact with other high schools, because I think we were very closely involved with Martin Luther King High School.
Right.
And that was a good time, because there was a lot going on in the city with Martin Luther King High School at the time. They had this bullseye on them. Oh, this school has this, they have that. Those students are infected with they had so many rumors that were attacking the school. So it was good to have somebody to draw some closure between schools, and had us working with Martin Luther King, as opposed to spreading vicious rumors about him. So
Right.
those were the late 90s, though.
Right.
So,
And then you graduated high school,
mhm.
ended up at Cheney University, the very first historically Black college and university in the United States. No, there's argument about that, but it is the first. And then by that time, so that would have been like 1997, 98.
That was 99.
99, because right,
first.
You went to Temple first, that's right. So by the time you ended up at Cheney, Dr. Holmes had come to Cheney University. So you had an opportunity, someone who had mentored me, and then I mentored you, then you had an opportunity to learn from Dr. Holmes as well. And I think you had a chance to take classes and things of that nature. So why don't you talk a little bit about that, about your experience with Dr. Holmes at Cheney University?
Yeah, so I took Dr. Holmes' class. A good friend of mine, Cameron Driver, who passed away 2 years ago now. We were RAs at Cheney at the time, and he said, "You pick out all your classes yet?" And I said, "No, I ain't pick out all class." I said, "I got one more." He said, "Why don't you take this class with me?" And I think it was a sociology course.
It might have been African American history, either African American history or political science, one of those two.
It was political science. And he said, "Yeah, this class would be fun." I said, "Politics, political science." I said, "Who's teaching it?" And he says, "Neil Holmes." I'm like, "Never heard of him, not taking it." And I asked around a couple of people. I said, "Anybody here, Dr. Holmes?" And it was, I forget the student's name. It's like, "Oh, you need to take that class. You're going to learn something." I said, as opposed to taking another class and learning something. So Cam came down and we went, I'll never forget, we got in his car. He said, "We're going to Wawa." So we went, we got some sandwiches. He said, "You signed up for your class yet?" I said, "Nah, I still got one more." He said, "Just take the class." I'm like, "Fine." And I'm glad that I did get a chance to take it. It was like the best class that I had during the week. And I was always under so much fire because I was in charge of the school newspaper at the time too. And I had a column on campus that if you ended up in my column, life wasn't good for you. And by default, they made life not so good for me, so it was a good thing I got to hide out in Dr. Holmes' class and learn some things. And even after class was over, we'd still sit around just powwow and just chatting it up, so it was the best of all worlds. You got the class, but then you got the extension of class. And, it's actually, of all the classes I took at Cheney, it's the only one I really remember.
Wow.
That's interesting. And like I just, as you saw, I just pointed out something that he taught me back in 1987. You know, here we are in 2021. So jumping ahead, here in 2000, well, we started in 2020 talking about this. Three of us decided to get together. Why don't we, get together and develop like a weekly podcast where, we can address not just the African American community, but I'd say at some point the entire African diaspora, because we're all connected. And there's a lot of content on YouTube, a lot of people, with podcasts. But what I've noticed, and it's no disrespect to them, most of them seem to be, dedicated to hip hop or athletics, and which is fine. I watch a lot of the ones dedicated to some of the old school hip hop artists. I love, watching some of those. But I thought, something was needed that's more just addressing the issues in our community in a positive and unbiased way. And taking more of a proactive approach as opposed to us talking like last week. A lot of people talked about the siege at the White House. And I know a lot of people talked about the fact that, okay, if that was Black Lives Matter, they would have been shot, so on and so forth. And not that I disagree with that at all, but I want to go more towards the aspect of what do we do to improve things in our community. So that's what I'm looking to do with this weekly podcast as we, work this and grow this. And so I'd like to hear from both of you. What do you hope to do before we get into our main topic for the day? What do you hope to accomplish with this weekly podcast that we're embarking on?
Well, one of the things I wanted to do was have this sort of act as a forum to discuss some of the, not just the critical issues, but some of the critical ideas. There's so much stuff being written right now. So many, we have so many Black folks that are writing really all kinds of stuff, and there's so many issues out there that we can really kind of chew on and look at and discuss, and not just from our perspectives, but also from the perspectives of some other thinkers and writers and activists that are out there. So that's what I would like to see happen.
Okay.
For me, it's more of the historical approach to it, being able to understand how we got here. When I hear people talk about slavery, and it's so funny, oh, the South, the South, the South. And I'm like, what about Detroit? Oh, that was the Underground Rip. No, there were plantations in Detroit.
Yeah.
People don't understand that. One of the last feats to get to freedom in Canada was to go through a plantation in Detroit. So being able to educate people on things and just put a historical context on it. Like hopefully we get some Black pastors that tune in so I can give them the history of the Cadillac, and understanding how that went down in Detroit. I think being able to look at it now, after being a researcher and an oral historian, public historian, it's like, wow, people rush to go buy an Escalade, but don't know the backstory behind the name. So being able to put things into context, and then after spending 15 years as a journalist, being able to pull history and journalism together to interpret what's happening.
I like that. And I like that we have the different, I wouldn't say different perspectives, but Dre, you come as an oral historian. I've spent, about 20 years in education in different capacities, in secondary education. Dr. Holmes spent several decades in post-secondary education, and has even headed up the African American Studies departments, and is largely responsible for some of the knowledge that I have and that you have. So I just want to point out that it was you that came up with the name Full Circle. And I thought that was perfect. When I was saying, like, what can we call this? I was coming up with a bunch of, I was like Swahili words and things like that. And then you said Full Circle. And I'm like, wow, that's perfect. So here we are. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Knowing Dr. Holmes, we could have just called this the bourgeoisie experience. And
All right. So now that we tapped into that, kind of laid the groundwork, why don't we talk a little bit about this inauguration and talk about the upcoming, I guess, the upcoming presidency. And let's talk about what we, not necessarily what we should expect, but what should we demand? And here's where I'm coming from with this. I'm a big fan of, I mentioned other podcasts that I watch. I'm a big fan of Dr. Boyce Watkins. I watch him all the time. And I saw something where he said, regardless of who's in office, and he said, you don't have to take my word for it, research it for yourself, whether it's Democrats in office, whether it's Republicans in office. If you look back historically, for African Americans, I'm talking about African Americans now, just historically, our land ownership hasn't increased, unemployment hasn't gone down. Basically, all of the key factors that we look as measures of improvement in our quality of life and economics and things of that nature haven't really improved. And one thing that I noticed that I feel we do, and I'm not the first one to say this, I'm not dropping anything shocking. People have said this all the time. We blindly support Democrats, and then they get into office and we don't demand anything. We're just glad to have somebody in there that's not openly hostile towards us. And we don't demand, even when Barack Obama was elected and we elected him, I think 91% of us voted for him. I heard a lot of people saying, well, let's just allow him to be the president of the United States. Let's not ask for too much. And we didn't. We didn't ask, and we did not receive. So what should we be demanding of this administration, because we're largely responsible for them being there? Dr. Holmes, what do you think? What should we demand of this administration?
I think one of the things that that he's mentioned in terms of his agenda is in the area of education. He wants to do some work around community colleges, free community college, and at the same time, if there's free community colleges, what happens to the HBCUs? So we have to look at those. Now, the president of Delaware State, Tony Allen, was one of the people who helped to organize his inauguration. So I don't know what sort of discussion he's having. And then Kamala Harris, among her first, is the first HBCU graduate to be a vice president. So I think one of the things we need to look at is what do the vice presidents get out of this? I mean, what do the HBCUs get out of this in terms of that free education? Because what we call the MSIs, minority serving institutions, the ones that serve Latinos, Africans, and indigenous people, we all serve the same students as the community colleges. And I know in this town, where in Richmond, Virginia, we have community colleges that are majority Black, but very few Black faculty and administrators on that campus. So so that means the students there don't get much in terms of Black history, etc., or just in terms of having some connection to the community in a certain sort of way. So even if there is, so we have to look at how is this one going to impact HBCUs, and how do we leverage that approach to free community college education to say that, hey, in order for those community colleges to do something to get that money, they also need to hire some Black folks and in the classroom and in administration, and hire them in a way that they can be there permanently and not just go through revolving door.
Okay, so I'm sorry, go ahead.
To your point, Dr. Holmes, I'd say one thing that we can get out of this, if you're going to have free community college, why not associate these community colleges with HBCUs? Why not form partnerships to not only filter these students into these classrooms on Black college campuses, but also to put that funding behind the education of these students. Because if you have the free, you figure you get an associate's degree for free. You know, you can go anywhere else in the world you want. But if you have a direct chain, let's say, for instance, you're studying computer science, you get your fundamentals down packed in community college. And let's say Dell Tech joins forces with Cheney University. You know, now you have this partnership and a feeder, whereas like you finish your first 2 years here and you automatically gain admission with a certain grade point average into Cheney University to get your bachelor's degree. This way you have a system that's set up in place where the enrollment is up in Black colleges, you have students interested in Black colleges, and you have funding, federal dollars that are flowing into these Black colleges to keep the doors open. I think that's one thing we should ask for. If you're going to have this free community college, why don't we go ahead and get a partnership going so we can start funding and keeping these Black colleges open? I mean, we don't need another situation like Morris Brown. You know, Cheney University has fallen on hard times. And even your elites amongst HBCUs, you have North Carolina A&T, you have Hampton, you have Howard, you know, you have these schools that are stalwarts here in the Black college community that still could use feeders. I mean, they have people that are vying to get into these places anyway. But if you have a very well prepared student from a community college versus a student who's not really sure what they want to do coming out of high school, it's a win-win for everybody.
Now, how would that be different in a way from the Pathways program that a lot of community colleges have now? Because, you know, most of them have partnerships where if you go to the community college for the first 2 years, you have automatic admission into some of these colleges. So say, let's use Community College of Philadelphia and Cheney University as an example. So if they probably have a Pathways, I'm not sure, I've been away from Philly for a while, but if you go to Community College of Philadelphia and then you automatically are admitted into Cheney, that's a form of a partnership. Right. But wouldn't a school like Cheney also need some type of subsidy for that tuition hit they're going to take for all those students that are now going to the community college for the first 2 years, as opposed to going to Cheney for the first 2 years? So do you envision some type of subsidy for those HBCUs?
Yeah, or either have them do the same thing, because the HBCUs do the same thing as community colleges do. They bring students in and really get them ready, you know, and move them into the pipeline. So you can come into an HBCU which are organized to develop those skills, those skills that you need to perform successfully in the academic world. So you can do one. We call, in this state, we call them articulation. In Virginia, we call them articulations. Right. And all the state schools have these articulation agreements, but that doesn't provide any, like you say, pathway unless there's some money there. Real money. The other thing that we need to do, I think, with the HBCUs is, and which Barack Obama didn't do. Barack Obama, for instance, said we need more Black teachers and other Latino teachers and so forth. But he put a bunch of money in another program, which is a program largely attended by white upper middle class folks, and they usually go in for a few years, teach a couple of years, and come out, become experts, and work their way up the ladder to become administrative experts. We need much money, bundles of money, to go in and help train a new generation of effective Black teachers and effective, Latinx and indigenous folk teachers to work in our communities and to work in our schools, and to help transform our schools into schools of excellence, the way they used to be. We're actually, during that time, what they call segregation, in the South in particular, I don't know, but in the South in particular, there were 6 or 7 states where in the South and in the Midwest, where the black teachers were better prepared than white teachers, better education, better prepared, more likely to have actually a graduate education and so forth. So we've lost that connection through what some people call integration. It's not really integration at all, because all that happened was they removed the teachers and the principals from the students, and kept certain students in certain schools and other students in other schools, and we just moved the leadership away. So that's one thing, is to do that. The other thing is to get the black HBCUs more involved in the community again, and to have them become community centers, deeply involved in the communities. And so we kind of lost it at Cheney at the point at which the urban center, what we used to call the urban center, was taken over by the rest of the state. And that as opposed to being expanded into an urban center that could really have gotten dug deep into the community. We did have classes in the high schools. We offered classes in the high schools. In those city schools that didn't offer AP courses, advanced placement courses, that sort of thing, we offered college courses. And so those sorts of things, I think, would work.
And I remember when you talk about that being at Temple University, I actually taught in the Pan-African Studies Community Education Program, whereas they offered classes to the general community for like $15.
Yeah.
They even offered GED prep. I taught a couple of GED prep courses. And I just remember, what that did for people. And just, I remember the last day when I was handing out certificates, a lot of people brought family members with them. It wasn't a graduation ceremony. It was just happened to be the last day of class. I'm handing out certificates, and family members telling the students how proud they were of them. So I just remember in Temple, if you're from Philly, you know this, but for those of you who don't know, Temple is in the heart of the city. Like it was public housing, like you're walking on a street by your building to go to your class, and it's public housing right there. I never recall there being any issues, anything like that, just saying that it was definitely in the heart of the city. So I felt like the Pan-African Studies community education program was vital, because if you're going to be in the heart of the city, you should be giving back to the city. You should, you should be doing something for the city. So we talked about education, and I know we don't have a lot of time left, but so in the time that we have left, if we could also include, what do we think for the economy? And when I say the economy, well, that is part of the economy, training up the workforce with education, I know. But with the economy, I mean strictly for the African-American community that supported, President Biden and Kamala Harris. What should we be demanding in that area?
I definitely think we should be demanding more than $2,000 stimulus checks. All day today, all I've heard people talking about, well, now that he's in, when am I going to get my check? And it's just like, okay, $2,000 is $2,000, but what happens when it runs out? I still believe that there has to be a way to get more people employed. There has to be a way to start filtering people into these jobs. There has to be a way to create jobs. I know here in Virginia, the running joke for me is, they're still doing construction on 95 in Northern Virginia, and, there has to be a job somewhere for somebody. But I think that also getting people into careers outside of STEM, because that's going to be one of those fields now that's going to be oversaturated. Everybody is going into STEM. There are, schools that are predicated to put people into these positions. A&T is one of them. And if we're talking about Black colleges, have a great engineering program. How many jobs do you have where where engineers are going to be needed? After a while, the market's going to be oversaturated. It reminds me a lot of with Atlanta. Everybody, oh, we're moving to Atlanta. You oversaturate the market. So what's left there now? Right. So I think looking into jobs, liberal arts jobs, and with this pandemic, what we've learned is there's a lot more to do digitally. So now you get people who can do things more long distance and remotely, as opposed to being in a place. So the question is now, what kind of jobs do we want? And how do we market those jobs? Like, education is fine. And, people going back to school, being retrained, but how do we get people into these programs? How do we get people into these jobs? So there has to be a correlation between education and jobs outside of oversaturated markets already.
And that's interesting because when you say that, because I shared with you all before we got started, I was listening to a conservative podcast today. And this gentleman is a huge Trump supporter. But, I listened to his show. He makes some good points. And I like the way he presents himself. He presents himself with class, so I can listen to him and not be disgusted, So he mentioned the fact that the Trump administration put out a 49-page document that outlines everything that they accomplished in the last 4 years. And this gentleman, he claimed that the Trump administration accomplished more in 4 years than the Obama administration accomplished in 8 years, so on and so forth. And one thing that he mentioned was Black unemployment went down, Latino unemployment went down, so on and so forth. Now that could have happened. I'm going to actually look for this document and research it, and I'll bring some of that information to the next show. That could have happened. It could have just been about a cycle of the economy, but oftentimes when we hear unemployment goes down, we're looking at oftentimes the minimum wage positions, positions that don't require a lot, So how do we push? I guess we talked about the training, and we talked about you talking about the jobs. What about business creation? How could we really get the president? What could we ask the president to do, whereas we could create more businesses in the minority community?
Well, it can't be the platinum plan. The platinum plan, I read that in about maybe 6 minutes. And what it was, there's money that's going to be put aside for businesses to grow, but then you read the small print and you look at how much money that you're going to pay in interest for these loans. And by the time you finish paying it, you're out of business. So it looked really good on paper. There has to be a way, if we're able to come up with all this money, was it $1.9 trillion today that was announced to get us out of this pandemic and get us out of this recession? If we can come at 1.9 million for that, there definitely should be a way of coming up with it, at least half or a little less than 1.9 trillion to put into the small business market. One thing that we have learned throughout this pandemic is that small businesses are critical in society in general, and Black communities could flourish from that. I mean, how many people do we know that have created online classes, people who've, just mom and pop stores, restaurants, and other businesses that, if they had the financial backing, could go out and expand more and be very profitable within their community. And then you have something that's in the community to be proud of. And then people start investing more money into their own communities that way. And once you start doing that, you start to see a change and a shift in society and the way things and the way people operate within their community. So I think that being able to come up with money for small businesses, be it grant money, be it low interest loans, these are things I think that we need to look at, and definitely not go back to the route of what was in the platinum plan, because the platinum plan would have had people looking at platinum but living on a foil paper budget. So we can't do that because that puts you behind the 8 ball already.
Yeah, and I think just to follow up just a little bit, I think when you look at the economic thing, number one, very important part of it is really to deal with this pandemic, because it's about 400,000 people died, and at least maybe 120,000 of those are African people. So we really need to deal with that. But I think one of the problems that I have with the Democratic Party, and I'm not a member of the Democratic Party or anything like that, but one of the problems I have with the Democratic Party is that when you go into these urban cities, urban sites where many of us live, what you find is mayors and city council people who are tied into the real estate interests, the big developers, and we've seen this whole system of gentrification that basically price people out of their homes and remove folks. So we need basically an end to that gentrification. We need to have homes that are affordable for people to live in, and we need to also uh, in order to have strong businesses, you have to have a strong working class that's going to go in and buy from those businesses. If you emphasize businesses and don't emphasize the working aspect, then you don't have really customers. So we need to figure out a way. How do you develop a strong Black working class? Because many of the proposals that we've done, or much of the policy that's been developed over the last I guess 60, 70, 80 years, let's say 60, 65, 70 years has been focused on developing a Black middle class and developing a Black impoverished and incarcerated class. So both parties have developed policies that end up putting us in prison, and policies that develop a Black middle class to help to administer those people who are either going to prison or who will be going to prison. So we need to say, how do we develop this Black middle class? How do we develop industry in the community? Because all the industry has fled the inner cities, the cities, and many of us are fleeing the cities now. We're being pushed out of cities into the what we call inner suburbs. So we need to have jobs that pay well, industrial jobs. And we also need to work, we also need those skilled jobs as well. I mean, they're going to be about 100,000, it's not a lot of people, but we're going to have about 100,000 electricians are about to retire all across the country. And similar numbers of plumbers and so forth, of folks about to retire from these things. And the push into those areas that occurred in the 60s has lightened up. So we don't have people filling those things that pay well and have good health care and so forth. So I think those have something to do with it. And also to have a health care plan, a real health care thing where people can, you don't have to depend on your job to have health care. That health care is just part of the society, and that comes through taxation or whatever. So I think all of those are things that we need to do, because we are in these. One of the things that Donald Trump said that was actually true when he campaigned in 2016 was that these cities are in bad shape. And we started going around and said, oh no, they're not in bad shape. But they were. They're in awful shape. You go to LA, which is a Democratic town, and people living on the street, and more people living on the street. And you go to Oakland, California, people are living on the street, and they're going to work every day. They're living on the street. They're living in tents and things, going to work every day. And these are happening because of the greed of these big developers who have their own agenda in terms of pushing us out of these cities and upping the income. The last thing I want to say is that, you know, the 15-hour minimum wage is fundamental. I mean, that's one thing that he signed on to. This is the lowest minimum wage we've had in the history of minimum wages in this country. So these are just some of the small things that could happen, but they're important. We need to have a place that we can live. And actually, the way you build houses now, you can develop houses. You can have factories to develop houses in these cities that employ folks. So we need to really employ people. We need to have communities where people don't have to get run out by bigger money interests that make it difficult for Black businesses to succeed, and to have and to have Black communities, to have African communities that have a cultural base that reflects the community that people live in, but more importantly, also reflect the a strong working class that where people live and can live in a community without having $1 million, and have that reflected in those communities as well.
Now, Dr. Holmes, you mentioned something when you the first part of your message. You talked about them locking us up, and we have about 5 minutes left, so we'll probably end on this topic. Shouldn't we, as an African community, start petitioning or really take the stance about the legalization of drugs? And here's why I say that. When I took your class, Black Family and Social Thought, it was taught by you and Dr. Aaron Mann.
Yeah.
And I remember that was probably like 1988, 89. And Dr. Mann at the time, he said, I am for the legalization of drugs. And at the, being I was 19, 20 years old, I was so shocked to hear that, from a college professor. He's for the legalization of drugs, and I took it almost like he was advocating for drugs, which he was not. And now, 30 years later, I've taken on the same stance. I feel that people shouldn't be locked up for having a drug problem. If I see someone smoking crack, I think that's terrible. I think they need help. I don't think they need to be thrown in jail. Also, it perpetuates violence, because if one guy is selling drugs over here, another guy is selling drugs over here, and they have a dispute over territory, they can't go to the police. They can't sue. You wouldn't see Walmart and CVS shooting it out, but you'll see two drug dealers shooting it out. Couldn't we eliminate a lot of these problems if we legalize drugs and just the people that have the drug problem start putting funding into getting them help as opposed to locking people up?
Well, yeah, I think legalization is and it's coming. It's starting with legalization of things like marijuana, and you have to understand that all these drugs were made illegal because of race and racism.
Exactly.
Marijuana was legal. It was something that everybody did. George Washington smoked weed, and everybody. And when there was an attempt to crack down, let's say, on blacks and Mexicans, we see marijuana made illegal. Cocaine was legal, and there was a time when cocaine was part of your work. If you were black in the South in some places, that was part of, that's what you were part of your pay, because they found that you'd work longer for less pay and harder if you had a little cocaine in your pay pocket.
That I didn't know. Okay.
And then there's a time right around the turn of the century, as we went from the 19th to the 20th century, the biggest heroin addicts were white women, and they never locked them up. They used educational means and whatnot to because heroin was sold as a health aid.
Right.
So they used education and different things. So getting rid of those, it's not the drugs that are illegal, really. It's us that are illegal, because just take marijuana. In a city like New York, 80-90% of all the drug arrests are black and Latino. Same thing in a city like DC and so forth. So you're not telling me that white folks don't smoke marijuana,
right?
And so it's we're the ones that are legal. And as it's being legalized, what's happening is that you have these big corporate groups coming in and buying up all of the stuff, and they'll be the dispensaries and so forth. So Virginia's conservative as it is, will probably have legalized recreational marijuana in about a year and a half, and it already has some health stuff. But who's going to be working those things? Who's going to really be raking in that $1 billion industry? I had a student at State who was talking about his community and so forth, what the youth were doing, and they were uh, selling, mostly selling weed, and I told him, look, man, I showed him. We went online and we looked at. I showed him, look, here is a journal, a business journal on marijuana. It's $1 billion business. A lot of it is grown all over the country, but you have places especially out west in Washington State, where the sheriff protects the people who are growing the marijuana plants. So for a long time, marijuana has been the biggest cash crop. It passed corn as the largest cash crop years ago. Even when it was legal inside the United States. It's not coming necessarily from all these other places where it used to come from, Colombia and Jamaica and all those places, but it's grown right here. And so, and some of these people who grow it, the growers, they're not worried about getting caught. And whites in the, wherever they use it, they're not worried about getting caught. And so it's not just a question of legalizing the marijuana and the cocaine and et cetera, and all the other drugs, and doing, like you say, looking at some of these addictions as health issues as opposed to criminal issues. It's also a thing of understanding that we are the ones that are illegal and not so much the drugs, because Richard Nixon said this. Once he told his people, my main problem is with the Negro. This is when, and he's worried about the Panther Party on the one hand, and also on the other side, you had, King had just gotten killed, but you had people from the King wing of the movement, and both of them had developed rainbow coalitions. You see, you had, blacks, Latinos, Native people, Asians, all wrapped around, and had blacks who had organized all these people around the fundamental injustices in the country. You even in the Panther parties, you had groups of young Appalachian whites who had a Confederate flag thing for their symbol for a long time. And nobody told them to get rid of it. They at a certain point, they understood that, hey, maybe we should get rid of this thing.
Right.
And these were kids who used to beat up black folks. And now you couldn't, if you were a Panther, you couldn't go in their neighborhood and the police couldn't come in their neighborhood and arrest them. So, and you also had the same thing with King with his movement. And so Nixon said, hey, we got to deal with the Negro. The Negro is the big problem, because the Negro or the African was basically the center to the organization in this country for justice and humanity. And he said, we have to deal with the Negro without looking like we're dealing with the Negro. So what do? You start dealing with laws, and you start enforcing laws in a way that you will end up, that you can enforce. You can lock somebody. If everybody's breaking the same law, you can lock up whoever you want to lock up.
Right.
So that's what they did. And then before that, we see intensive. There's a young woman who did a couple of books have come out on the liberals and their role in this, what some people call the carceral state, and this intensive policing of our communities. That much of that happened in the the Great Society administrations. They happened under Bill Clinton's administrations and so forth. Biden himself was involved in passing some of this legislation early on in the game. And so this whole idea that you had to lock up the Black community was really in response to Black power as a movement, right? And to really assertive civil rights, as King as a movement, which in some ways he was, looking at kind of a class struggle and not just a struggle just of a few things here and there. So this move was an attempt to lock up Black power as much as it was an attempt to do anything else. So we have to understand it within that context, and as people begin to legalize this and legalize that, and because they need the tax dollars. The government here in Virginia said, "Hey, man, we need the tax dollars,"
Right.
and they sold it on the fact that they were going to help, Black folks get this and Black folks get that. But basically, where's the money? Like they say, you got to follow that money. Who's going to really get that big money? Who are those big businesses that are going to go in and make those billion-dollar deals? And maybe they'll hire a few people here and there.
Right.
Unless we are kind of on top of things. But this is I agree with you. We have to really do that, but we also have to have real health care in the country too. If you have real health care, you can do some things. Now, the other thing is that, even when we make this a health issue, you have to understand that our the pharmaceutical companies kill more people than your local drug dealer. Your local drug dealer is looking out for your interests more than those folks that were selling Oxycontin and all that other stuff.
And they're the biggest lobbyists.
Yeah,
they lobby more to Congress than anybody. And I knew this was gonna happen. We've gone over our time. I knew we were gonna get to talking. Dre, I want to give you an opportunity to say anything you want to say before we shut this one down and come back for next week.
It just feels good to breathe again. We don't have this orange cloud above us anymore that's suffocating the airwaves. It was good to see civility introduced to society again. We saw a 21 gun salute with howitzers, and a grand old send off for our orange friend, and it just feels good to wake up and see people being civil again.
Definitely, I agree. Well, it was great talking with you guys for this first time. I look forward to many more of these. To everyone that gets a chance to see this, please take a look at our website, fullcircleshow.com. On our website, we also have information on our social media sites. So we ask you to like our Facebook page and our YouTube page. If you like our Facebook page, you'll have an opportunity to see this live as it's airing. And we'll definitely in future broadcasts give people an opportunity to interact with us and send us their comments while we're discussing these topics. So again, I enjoyed this, and I look forward to seeing everybody again next week. All right. Take care.
Take care.